Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And as we continue to deliberate the various developments from both here in Israel as well as throughout the region and beyond, it's always important to remember that 161 days ago, the Islamist terror groups from the Hamas-plagued Gaza Strip launched an onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering some 1,200 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping 246 individuals, including elderly, men, women, children, and infants. 134 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date. Let's now turn to TV7's editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, I'd like to initially focus on the Gaza Strip. Nevertheless, we just had a war cabinet meeting a couple of hours ago in Tel Aviv at the Kiryat, the headquarters of the Defense Ministry. What can you tell us about that? I understood that plans were approved and also outlines were rejected.
So, yes, you are right, 161 days, and what was once a major headline now is receding into a routine sort of reporting, and that goes to say that the fighting on the ground and in the tunnels in Gaza is more of the same sort of story. Being reported, Israeli units, especially in the Khan Yunis area, are fighting their way methodically in order to get rid of the remnants of the Hamas force there. Also in other parts of Gaza, but the main effort is still in Khan Yunis, which is quite south, but not as south as Rafah, which is supposedly the next and final battleground. Now, there are two cabinets in the Israeli government now. The outer cabinet is the old Ministerial Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defense, and there are a dozen or so ministers there, more than that, representing both the portfolios and the parties which have a membership in the government at large. The inner cabinet, which is the one you referred to, is the emergency war cabinet made up of the old government plus two former chiefs of staff, retired lieutenant generals Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot. This five-member cabinet, along with an observer who is not a minister, a former minister, and the chiefs of the various armed and security services, they deliberated the latest response by Hamas to the proposal pushed by the US administration, mediated by Qatar and Egypt, regarding the hostage deal, which will culminate in a ceasefire for some 6 to 8 weeks. Apparently, this was approved as, at least as terms of reference for an Israeli mission to Qatar to pursue this offer. At the same time, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that he has approved plans for the Rafah operation. Only this morning, spokespersons for the US administration said that they have not yet seen and therefore have neither approved nor disapproved such a plan, which they insist is essential before they give their blessing to this plan. There was quite a heart-wrenching demonstration of families of the hostages across the gate in the compound, Hakiria, as you said, while the war cabinet said, and the Israeli public is awaiting new reports of hopefully the success of such a deal.
Indeed, of course. On the one hand, everybody is hopeful to see the release of the hostages. Nevertheless, it will come at a very expensive cost. Naturally, the release of hundreds of terrorists with blood on their hands, many of them, as well as other terms and conditions that were coupled with these that are not favorable for Israel and may also make the additional steps, including the offensive in Rafah, more difficult from an operational perspective. But let's now turn to the commander of the Israeli Air Force Task Force for Air and Missile Defense, namely Brigadier General in Reserve Doron Gavish. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to ask you particularly, now that the plans for an offensive into, or a ground offensive, expanding the operation into Rafah, what can you tell us about that? Naturally, every time the IDF expands to another area, we see more and more so rocket fire from different locations trying to alleviate or distract somewhat the IDF from its key objectives, obviously failing to do so since the operational activities are right now very focused on two specific areas, and that is the central Gaza Strip and, as Mr. Oren mentioned, Khan Yunis, particularly the Hama neighborhood. What can you tell us about it?
Well, indeed, Jonathan, it seems that this threat is not the main threat anymore. It is kind of a threat, of course, but we're not talking about the numbers that we've seen in the past or even nothing which is close to it. The real situation in the south part of Israel and in the Gaza Strip, and the real question about the next step is, I would say there are three main challenges. The first one is the amount of civilians over in this area. We have to remember that most of the civilians, those were the areas that they were moved to, those were the humanitarian areas, so there is a large amount of people in this on this area, and of course every plan would have to include a specific plan of how to deal with the civilians. This has always been something that the IDF was looking at, and of course it would be the same in Rafah. The civilians would be one of the most important things that we would have to deal with once we are getting into this area. The other thing is Egypt. We have to remember that the Egyptians are also very concerned when it comes to Israel operation toward this area. It is on the Egyptian border, so this is also something that, of course, we would have to take into consideration. And the third one is the pure operational challenge, which is the tunnels that we know that are on all this area. We know that they are also in Rafah, and fighting within those tunnels, it is still very challenging, mainly when we know that the hostages, this is probably would be the place that they would be with. And we know that the Hamas leaders wants mainly Sinwar. He wants those hostages around him because he sees them as his saviors in a way, or those are the ones that he does it with his own people. So of course he would do it also with the hostages. He knows everything about human shields. So this is really the challenge that we see in those areas. But at the end of the day, the IDF is planning for it for quite a while. It is not a plan that was invented in the last week. This is something that the IDF is planning for some time with all those means that are relevant to this specific area, doctrines, what would be the right way, which units are the ones that are relevant for this area. So all of those considerations we're taking, and the plan is ready. And as it was mentioned, it was also approved by Bibi Netanyahu and by the cabinet. So it's a matter of a decision now. It is not a matter of the operational preparedness, because the IDF is ready for it.
Thank you, General Gavish. Let's now turn to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmett, formerly an Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to ask you immediately about 2 points. The first, according to a report or a couple of reports, Israel already notified the Egyptians. On the one hand, a report which was corroborated to me by senior Egyptian officials that indeed they have been notified. And a second point, that the Americans have received the plan and have also approved such a ground offensive, something that was not corroborated to me yet, but I'm still waiting for a response from the State Department. Let's see if that arrives anytime soon. Nonetheless, what are we expected to see? Is there going to be a pushback by the administration, irrespective of what happens behind closed doors?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd say that I'd be careful to say that the U.S. has approved or disapproved the plan. That's not our position. Our position should be that we either support or don't support the plan. And I think the parameters for supporting or unsupporting the plan are quite simple. Minimize civilian casualties. In fact, more than that, the U.S. administration wants to see this as targeted special operations, not a ground assault that we normally associate with taking a city. So I think that in many ways it doesn't really matter, because if there's one civilian casualty in the assault on Rafah, and there certainly will be, whatever the manner in which you fight it, there will be significant criticism from a proportion of the American people that we're not just going to hear in protest, but we're also going to hear in Congress, because apparently we're not only approving and disapproving military plans, but now we're also getting into the business of approving and disapproving elected leaders inside of Israel.
Apparently so. We will touch on that more momentarily, but I'd like to turn to the United Kingdom, where we're joined by retired Colonel Joel Rayburn, formerly a senior director at the NSC for a number of countries in the region, as well as the special U.S. envoy for Syria, and currently, of course, the founding director of the American Center for Levant Studies. It's good to see you, Colonel. I'd like to also immediately ask to your perspective on the various complexities about such an anticipated offensive. And at the same time, we're hearing about increased efforts to provide substantive quantities of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. But it seems like the United Nations is not managing to take those trucks that cross into Gaza and distribute it in a fashion that would reach all of the civilians that are seemingly in need.
A very difficult situation. I viewed it as the U.S. idea to build a temporary pier so that there could be sea deliveries of aid was intended partly to take the pressure off the land crossing across Rafah in the event that the Israeli forces launched an operation into Rafah. So I think actually that was a constructive step from the U.S. side, and also probably partially to offset the pressure that's coming on the ground-based convoys that do come in, that the IDF has been helping to facilitate. But I mean, the humanitarian delivery situation in Gaza, for as long as this conflict goes on, is going to be messy. It's going to be extremely difficult, and you can see that it's going to be fraught also on the ground. There was with the incident of a local clan leader in North Gaza who was assassinated by Hamas within the past couple of days because of his role in helping to facilitate aid deliveries beyond the reach of Hamas. So I think you can say this is an imperfect situation. So I think our expectations should be fairly low concerning the humanitarian situation and the ability to deliver aid effectively against the backdrop of this kind of conflict.
Indeed, and of course, to facilitate security for the Biden administration's aspirations to establish a amphibian pier, Mr. Olin, the 162nd Division is currently deployed along the coastline of Gaza City and adjacent areas as well, preparing for the arrival of this pier that is currently en route roughly, according to DoD, they're speaking about 50 days until arrival. What can you tell us about it?
The problem, and our guests, both General Kimmett and Colonel Rayburn, know it much better than us Israelis. The problem in a place like Iraq was that the wish to topple Saddam and his henchmen was right, but the de-Ba'athization caused such a chaos that Iraq is now in a worse shape than it was some 21 years ago. And in Gaza, the problem is that Hamas started out in the 80s as a sort of charity, welfare, education organization, Dawah. And when Israel embraced it, also developed its military or terrorist wing, the Ezzadin al-Qassam brigade. And now you cannot just peel off the terrorist wing and keep the other functions available. So there is no one to take care of the distribution. Once the aid gets ashore from the floating pier or dock or whatever you want to call it, there is no one to keep law and order and avoid looting by starving families or by criminal gangs who want to make a profit. So the administration is saying that their answer to it is flooding the zone. Term, I believe. If there is so much aid available to anyone, there will be no commercial point in trying to steal it and then try to sell it for profit. Now, there is some anger at Israel because the port of Ashdod is a mere half-hour drive north of the northern part of Gaza, the Erez crossing. But Israel refuses, for several reasons, to allow trucks to go this short route, which could have been done immediately rather than wait the 50 to 60 days, which you referred to. And therefore, what you asked about the 162nd Division being deployed along the coast, it's mostly to stop Hamas snipers from sneaking up from a tunnel and trying to launch rocket-propelled grenades or anti-tank guided missiles at the American personnel and equipment so that to drive them back. And it wouldn't be beneath the Hamas to do it because many times when Israel tried before the war to allow trucks and fuel and whatever to cross from Kerem Shalom or other points of entry, Hamas shot at them just to show that it is in control. And it is willing to let Palestinians starve or stay in the dark just to show that Hamas is in charge.
Well, we're going to immediately drive to three separate sectors, and therefore I'd like to ask each of you to keep it as short as possible, but as informative as possible within that short period of time. And for that, General Gavish will start with the northern front of Israel. Lebanon seems to remain hostile towards Israel. The Iranian proxy Hezbollah has launched a number of projectiles towards Israeli territory. What can you tell us about that? Once again, shortly, please.
Well, hostile is almost an understatement. We are in a war. We say it more than one, although it is not a full-scale war. So we are still on this same low-level war. But in the last week, we could say, we saw literally hundreds of rockets that were shot toward Israel. The Iranians are trying to saturate the defense of Israel. by shooting salvos, quite large salvos. We could say that from the operational point of view, the results in the Israeli side are quite impressive. The vast majority of those rockets were intercepted by the Israeli air defense forces, and the strikes that have been done by Israel as a retaliation to those rockets that were shot toward Israel were quite significant. Some of them close to the border, but others quite into, I would say, more than 100 kilometers plus minus inside Lebanon. It is still under the context, meaning that the Hezbollah is shooting toward Israeli bases, usually military bases, military installations, most of what is shooting. And when Israel retaliates, it is with this context to those areas that the UAVs are being sent from, the launchers are being sent from, and so on. The last word that I would say that there was a kind of a debrief within the IDF, what have happened in the last few months with the Hezbollah. And looking at the Hezbollah, we could see that they had more than 300 terrorists that were died during this time, a lot of targets that were strike, and we could say that within the time that passed, some of those capabilities of the Hezbollah is being denied for a future if something would appear.
Thank you, General Gavish. Of course, there are reports also about Iran trying to expedite efforts to smuggle weaponry into Lebanon to further bolster the Iranian proxy there, Hezbollah, and it is doing the same. Also in the Red Sea and Yemen, particularly, where the Iranians are trying to facilitate and bolster the Houthi tribe, which of course has bought the allegiance from many tribes throughout that country. And therefore, I'd like to ask you, General Kimmett, what do we see right now in the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb, in the Gulf of Aden? We're seeing an intensified effort to target freedom of navigation at large, but also the United States, Great Britain, and Western allies throughout that coastline.
Yeah, it's hard to be terribly critical without the facts, but it just strikes those of us that are watching this carefully that we are still in the business of catching rockets rather than taking aggressive actions against the sites, but more importantly, against the sources of the supply and the supply routes coming into the Houthis. It can't be that those rockets are infinite in quantity, and I think until we take a little more aggressive action and a little more risky action, this is just going to be a matter of them shooting, us catching for an extended period of time. I would note, Jonathan, that we've also got to watch what the Iraqi Hashid have said about perhaps moving over to the west and trying to do the same interdiction operations in the Mediterranean as we're seeing in the Red Sea. But I think that's one of those watch this space until we see some actual capability.
Indeed, we did also hear the leader of the Houthi tribe come out with a televised statement in which he highlighted that over the course of the period in which the Houthis have pledged to thwart maritime shipping through the strategic Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, they have struck roughly 73 vessels, and as part of that, they also pledged to expand their operations. Again, something that does not really come at a dire cost. It seems like the response by the United States and its allies, Operation Prosperity Guardian, does not seem to hold the one responsible for facilitating those attacks, namely the Islamic Republic of Iran. And therefore, I'd like to ask you, Colonel Rayburn, what can be done and what not only can be done, but should be done at this point in time?
Yeah, I think long before now, there should have been a return of serious economic pressure against the Iranian regime for its sponsorship, not just of the Houthis, but also the Hashid. I mean, essentially all of the groups that are involved in this post-October 7th violence under the axis of resistance. And there should have been not just, there are things the U.S. can do unilaterally. restoring sanctions pressure using our sanctions authorities in the U.S. dollar, but this is something that there should be an international political diplomatic coalition that's enforcing this. I mean, it should have been done in concert, and it should be done for the entire basket, I think, of provocative, destabilizing Iranian regime behavior, including their provision of arms to Russia for use in the Ukraine war. That is the picture perfect case for EU concerted action, UK action, and then frankly UN Security Council action. I mean, there should be sanctions proposals, resolutions being introduced at the UN Security Council right now, and force the Chinese and the Russians to have to play defense along those lines, try to restore some of this international pressure, along in concert with, as I say, sanctions from the eurozone and sanctions in the U.S. dollar. That should have been done long before now, and I think it's a missing ingredient alongside the necessary sort of operational steps that General Kimmett was mentioning.
General Kimmett, I will grant you those last several sentences. There was also for a response, but also for a reaction to the conclusion of a maritime exercise by China, Russia, and Iran in the Gulf of Oman. What can you tell us about that? What signal are they sending, as they have highlighted in their statements, particularly China, that this is an alliance that will go to the long run, indicating obviously two focused words: alliance, long run?
Yeah, I'd say two things. Number one, the record of sanctions against Iran has been pretty poor, and I don't think tighter sanctions will make much of a difference in terms of altering their behavior. In terms of the Red Sea, that mistake was probably made in the beginning of the Obama administration, partially at the end of the Bush administration, when we allowed the Chinese into the counter-piracy operation off the coast of Somalia. The Chinese not only came in with their first blue water operation that they'd ever done, but while they were there, they built the largest port in the region in Djibouti. The Russians were part of this as well. So they had a good infrastructure and footprint 10 years ago, almost 15 years ago, to expand their capability with other allies such as Iran. And I think we're now just seeing the fulfillment of those long-term aspirations that the Chinese had when they built that port in Djibouti.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank General Kimmett, Colonel Rayburn, General Kavish, and Mr. Oren for your time and insight. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
Shalom, I'm Danny Ayalon, former Israeli ambassador to the United States, former deputy foreign minister and member of Knesset. Today, I'm very privileged to be hosting TV7's Middle East Review and also being a panelist of the various shows of TV7, which I find the most enlightening, most educating if you really want to understand the world, the global scene as well as the regional scene of the Middle East. It is worthwhile to watch TV7.